Hello and welcome to the Tangystitches podcast. My name is Claire and this is my knitting podcast where I'll be sharing all about my knitting projects and journey. So I hope that you'll sit back, relax, grab your yarn and needles, and enjoy this time with me. This is the very first episode of this podcast. So in this episode, I want to give a quick introduction to who I am and why I wanted to start this podcast, and then go into 4 finished objects, a couple of whips, and some acquisitions and future plans. And I think we'll unbox some yarn on this episode too. So let's get started. So because this is my first episode, I wanted to start with an introduction. Like I said, my name is Claire and I currently live in San Francisco, and I am a longtime knitter. I actually learned how to knit from my grandma when I was a child, and I have knit on and off since then, but really have become a little bit obsessed with it this year, which is why I kind of wanted to start this podcast now since I've finished a lot of projects. The cardigan that I'm wearing is actually the second garment that I ever knit, and I think I knit this cardigan almost 8 years ago. So it had been a while since I had knit a full garment, but this was the second garment that I ever made. The first one was a V-neck sweater, which maybe I will bring to the podcast at some later point. And this was the second garment that I ever made, and my first finished object will be the third garment that I ever made. So I made this cardigan so long ago that I really don't remember any of the details about it. Don't know what yarn I used or what pattern I used, but I am pretty sure that the pattern came from a book because I used to knit basically everything from books, and didn't really know much about like the patterns that I see on Instagram all the time now. Just looking at this sweater, I can tell that it was seamed together. So the sleeves were seamed and there's a seam running down the side as well. This cardigan does have pockets, which I think is pretty cool. And looking back at it, it is pretty cool to know that I had already made kind of a wearable garment 8 years ago. So let's move on to my first finished object. This is the Mia sweater by Coco Amour Knitwear. And this sweater is a top-down raglan sweater that has a folded, twisted rib collar and some broken rib pattern on the sleeves that also goes down the side of the sweater to the bottom of it. And this is a sweater that I started knitting back in November and finished in the end, I think around February or March. And it was actually when I was knitting on this sweater that I started to watch knitting YouTube and knitting podcasts. And it was around that time that everybody was coming out with the Everything That I Knit in 2023 videos. And I just loved watching those videos so much and got so inspired from them. And that's another reason that I wanted to start my own podcast. So when I first cast this on back in November, I did do a gauge swatch at that point, but I think my lack of experience with garment knitting made it so that even though I did do the gauge swatch, I didn't really take it into account when choosing my size. And I did not hit gauge and didn't really think much of it at the time, which is very, very silly looking back at it. But I ended up casting on a small at that point, and I knit the collar and started knitting top down, got to the point where I split the sleeves. So I had finished the entire yoke of the sweater, And that was the first time that I tried to put it on and realized that it was going to be way too small, so I really couldn't even get my arms through it at that point. So then I ended up frogging the entire thing and starting completely over. And at that point, I did take another look at my gauge swatch. So I tried to calculate how much smaller my gauge was or how many more stitches I had to pick a size that would give me the measurements of the small. So I ended up casting on a large, which is 2 sizes up from the small. And that was the size that I knit. I got to the point where I split for sleeves and tried it on then, and everything looked like it was gonna fit well and be kind of the positive ease that I wanted for the sweater. But one thing that did happen was that after I had finished knitting this sweater and blocked it, that this yarn ended up growing so much in like an unexpected way. So it ended up growing much more than I think my gauge swatch had indicated. Also, the yarn that I used to knit this sweater is Illimani Santi. So this yarn is a blend of merino, baby alpaca, yak, and silk. And I actually really love this yarn. I think the fabric that it makes is so soft, drapey, and nice. But I did find that it grew a lot with blocking. I had knit this sweater to be a kind of cropped length. Not super cropped, but not full length. And it was such a good thing that I did, because now it grew to be a full length sweater. The other thing was that the sleeves ended up growing so much that I had to take out the cast off edge, bind off edge, and re-knit them because they were just too long. I think I ended up taking back maybe 5 or 6 inches of the sleeves. So you can imagine just how long they were after blocking. One other thing that I'll mention about this is that in the pattern, the sleeve design is actually not the sleeve that I'm showing here. So in the pattern, it's much more of a blouse-like sleeve where there are not any kind of decreases. So you just have the sleeve and you knit down to the end. And at the cuff of the sleeve, you actually do a little bit of twisted rib, just like in the bottom. So the sleeve that I ended up knitting is more of a sweatshirt style sleeve that has 1x1 ribbing at the bottom. And I actually knit both sleeves at the same time so that I could try them out and decide which one I liked better. So that was before blocking, but I had one sleeve knit to pattern, and then for the other sleeve, I knit this kind of sleeve with some decreases and then this 1x1 cuff. And when I was wearing it around at that point, one thing that I noticed was that with the sleeve written in the pattern, it really was hard to keep the sleeve up. You really couldn't roll it up and have it stay. So I think I mostly decided on this style of sleeve because I thought it would be just much more practical to wear and do things around the house, for example. One other thing about the sizing, I think one thing that I hadn't really thought about before picking the size large was that when you're grading a design, it's not that each size is just gonna scale up in the same way or be like exactly proportional as you go from like the smallest size to the largest size. And I think maybe that's kind of obvious, but when I was choosing the size, then I was just thinking about in terms of my stitch gauge, what percentage smaller was it, and then what percentage bigger in measurement would kind of match that. But I wasn't really thinking about proportions very much. So I do think that this proportionally doesn't fit probably as well as if I had knit a small with the correct gauge. So that I think is just something that I need to keep in mind for future projects. What else? So in terms of wear, I finished knitting this in February or early March maybe. So it's been a couple of months now, and there is quite a bit of pilling on the sleeves and on the sides here. I guess it has not pilled enough that it's bothered me enough to have me fix it. My camera just turned off because it was overheating, so I will need to figure out how to deal with that, I guess, in future podcasts. I think what I was talking about was the wear and the fact that I do see quite a bit of pilling on the sleeves already. But I think after a couple of months of wear, this is probably expected, especially since this yarn is very soft. So eventually I will be able to shave these off, and I think this sweater will still look very nice. So that was the first project that I completed this year, and I think it turned out really well. And what I've really learned from it is that gauge swatching is really important, and that even if you gauge swatch, it might be the case that for a full garment, because of the weight of the garment, it might end up stretching actually even more than the swatch that you blocked. So this is the Mia sweater. Let's move on to my second finished object. And my second finished object is a Cumulus Tee. This is the Cumulus Tee by Petiteknit, a very popular pattern, and I knit this as part of a knit along. So it was the Cumulus mini cal that was hosted by Marlene Knits and Julia Marks back in March, and I actually cast this on right on March 1st, and it took me just about 2 weeks to finish knitting this. I did knit the Cumulus Tee in the recommended yarn, so this is Knitting for Olive pure silk in the color copper, and I did really enjoy working with this yarn actually. So in the pattern, I think it calls for size 3mm needles, and I did not have any 3mm needles, so I used a US 3 or 3.25mm needle. And when I gauge swatched, I did notice that my gauge was just slightly big, so it wasn't dramatically off, but it was off by a little bit. So I ended up knitting the extra small size, which is the first size, and wanted it to come out, I guess, just a little bit bigger than the measurements of that extra small size. And I think the sizing actually came out perfectly for me. One thing that I did when I was knitting this, so this is a top-down t-shirt that is a raglan, and you start kind of at the back and shoulder portion, and you start increasing for the sleeve and for the front and back. The raglan increases here on the side, and I didn't have any stitch markers that were small enough to be put on my size 3 needles, so I ended up using some floss, and what I did was just take floss and tie them into little circles to use as stitch markers. but it wasn't very sturdy at all. So what happened was that after a few rows of knitting, the floss would break and I would lose my stitch marker. And at that point, I was just trying to do the increases around the raglan stitch by eye. And I think I did a pretty okay job of it. There is like one portion of it, one raglan stitch, where I kind of messed up where I was doing my increases. So I had a section where maybe there's like one extra stitch in the sleeve that should have been in the back. But I don't think it's really noticeable at all. So there was not really an issue there. And I did end up buying some stitch markers so that for any next projects, I'll have the tools that I need. This is the first time that I knit any kind of I-cord detail. So this pattern is finished with I-cord around the neckline and the sleeves and the bottom. And when you're knitting this I-cord edging in the pattern, you are meant to decrease every, I think it was every 5 stitches or every 5 or 6 stitches, you decrease so that the edging is not wider than your knitted garment. And I did do those decreases at the bottom. And I also did the decreases for the sleeves, but then when I put them on, I felt like the sleeve was actually too tight with those decreases. So I ripped it back out and then redid it where I didn't do any of the decreases, but I did go down to a size 2 needle. And I think that turned out really well for the sleeve. And for the neckline, I did just follow the pattern. This t-shirt, I feel like I have worn so many times since I finished knitting it. It's really easy to wear. I really like the pure silk yarn. I think it's really lightweight, very drapey, and this is just so easy to throw on. I am not seeing too many signs of wear. There's a tiny bit of pilling that I see, but nothing dramatic. And I have really just enjoyed wearing this t-shirt. Maybe the last thing that I'll mention about it is that I was already wearing it before blocking. So I was wearing it probably like 3 or 4 or 5 times before I actually blocked it. And I didn't think that blocking this yarn would do that much because I was under the understanding that blocking relaxes wool fibers, and because this is a silk fiber, I didn't know whether I expected it to grow as much as it did, but it definitely became a little bit bigger. Not as dramatic as my Mia sweater, but I did find that this yarn does block out quite a bit also. I think the size ended up perfect still, so I really enjoyed knitting this t-shirt and enjoy wearing it too. So this was a great project. One last thing that I'll mention about this Cumulus Tee is that I ended up using just 3 balls of yarn, so that is 150 grams. For the extra small size in the pattern, the yardage is listed at 200 grams, which is 4 balls of the pure silk yarn. And I think one of the reasons that I used less was that I did knit this length, I think maybe 1 or 2 centimeters shorter than the pattern suggests. And I also knit the sleeves a lot shorter than the pattern suggests. So in the pattern, the sleeve goes almost to the elbow, but I decided to make mine more of a cap sleeve length, which I think works well for me. So this is my Cumulus Tee, and we can move on to my third finished object, which is the Soho Scrunchie by Tori. So this is a scrunchie that I made actually for St. Patrick's Day. I was going on a trip to Nashville for St. Patrick's Day weekend, and actually this was the time of the Bay Area Yarn Crawl. This was an event that was happening across the Bay Area over 2 weekends. So it was St. Patrick's Day weekend and the weekend after that, where they had this bingo card that you could get stamped for every store that you went to, and there were 21 stores in total. So it was a large number of stores, and I actually had the Friday before St. Patrick's Day off from work, and that was the first day of the yarn crawl. So I started to go to the stores then, and I was thinking about knitting this scrunchie for St. Patrick's Day, so I kept my eyes open for a green yarn, and the one that I ended up getting was from Seismic yarn. So these are the two other ones that I got. This is a local hand dyeing company based in Daly City, I think. And I actually met the owner of this brand at one of the stores. So on this yarn crawl, I met her. Ava was her name, at Aranea. I forget exactly what the store is called, but it's a yarn store that is in Hayward in the East Bay. And Ava was there showing off some of her unspun fiber. I think they were art bats. And I don't really know anything about spinning or fiber art, so I was talking to her a little bit about that art bats. Then I actually got this yarn at a yarn store in Pacifica, which is the Royal Bee Yarn Co., which had a big display of a bunch of the yarns from Seismic yarn. So I ended up getting 3 of them, the 2 that I just showed you, and then also this green color, which I wound up to make this scrunchie. And this is a fingering weight merino nylon blend, a sock yarn, and I held it double to make this scrunchie. And this scrunchie, the pattern doesn't specify which yarn weight you need, so you can really use any yarn weight. And the way that you make it is basically you start knitting in the round and you knit a tube, which you then fold back on itself around a hair tie, Kitchener stitch it together to turn it into kind of this donut shape. And this is kind of a funny story. So I knit this scrunchie fully on the flight from San Francisco to Nashville. And when I started knitting, the first time I cast on, as soon as the flight took off, maybe even before the flight took off, I was already casting on. And then I started knitting in the round and had almost gotten to the full length of what I needed when I realized that I had twisted my stitches. So it was twisted when I started knitting in the round. And at that point, it was really sad because I had to rip it back. And I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to finish the scrunchie on the flight then. So this was probably midway through the flight, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I have to start over at this point. So I ripped it back out and then cast on, and then very carefully joined it back in the round. And I was basically knitting just so furiously, trying to get it to the length that I needed. And I finally did get it to the length that I needed. Started to do the Kitchener stitch, and at this point we're already descending. And when the flight landed, we couldn't go to the gate right away because I think something was happening at our gate. So we were just on the ground for a little while. And I think I needed that time. And I just finished joining the tube together by the time that we pulled into the gate. So I just finished it in time because I knew that once I landed, there really wasn't going to be time to work on it. But I finished it in time and then wore it as part of my St. Patrick's Day outfit. And so I think that was really fun. And I also think this scrunchie was such a fun way to show off the colors of this hand-dyed yarn. I'm really happy with the way that it came out, and it was a very fun, fast project to knit up. Okay, moving on to my final finished object. This is, oh, it's inside out. This is the Rippe Bralette by Jessie Maed Designs. And I did extend it in length so that it would be a crop top length. And the yarn that I used for this is Freia Fine Handpaints, a sport superwash yarn that is a blend of merino and silk, and is in this ombre watercolor colorway. So maybe I'll put a picture of what that ball of yarn looked like when I got it. I actually got this yarn also on the Bay Area yarn crawl. It is from Atelier Yarns in San Francisco, so one of my local yarn stores here in the city. So the Rippe Bralette is knit from the bottom up. So you cast on at the bottom and you do a little bit of a twisted rib section before going into 3x3 rib. Then you knit up the length of the body, and you get to the point where you cast off the stitches for the back, and there is some twisted rib at the back too. And once you've casted off those stitches, then you come back to the front and you knit these two triangle portions separately back and forth. And this was a very interesting challenge because I was using this color changing gradient yarn, and when I was knitting the tube portion of it, there was no issue, so I could just keep knitting and it makes this beautiful gradient. But when I got to these triangles, because the triangles are knit separately, then what I realized was that you couldn't just knit like the pattern tells you to, which is to knit one triangle and then go to knit the second triangle, because then the color change would not match across the two triangles. So what I ended up doing was basically knitting just a couple of rows, maybe 3 rows on each side, and then breaking the yarn so that I could continue on with the next side, knitting 3 rows and then breaking the yarn again. So the back of it here, I don't know if you can really tell because the ends are weaved in, but I had so many ends to weave in the end because I was just breaking the yarn constantly. But I am really happy with the way that the gradient turned out. I think it turned out really nice. I also did the same thing with the straps. So with the straps too, I would use different sections of yarn that had different colors. And I even got a little section of yellow here to add on to the straps. And that yarn actually just came from the ends of the yarn that I was using for the triangle after I weaved in those ends. So this was a really fun project to work on. I think it would have been such a quick knit if I didn't have to break that yarn constantly, because knitting the triangles I think did take me maybe like a few extra hours to really get the gradient down and figure out how many rows to knit before I had to switch over to the other triangle. There was some trial and error there. And I also knit originally the straps to be too short. So I thought they might stretch out with blocking, and I didn't want the straps to be too long. But what I did realize is because I have a smaller chest, I guess I don't really need the straps to give me kind of any kind of support actually. So I just need them to kind of be the exact length from the back to that top of the triangle. I really liked how this knit up, and it was really fun in this colorway. When I bought the yarn, I was thinking about knitting a crop top out of it. It was a 75-gram ball of yarn, and I used almost all of it. So this was maybe like 65 grams of yarn in the end of this sport weight yarn. One thing that I remember reading about from Ravelry projects is that other people who use the recommended needle size, which was a US size 4 or 3.5 millimeter needle, they mentioned that the fabric could be a little bit thin. And I do agree that the fabric is a little bit thin, but I didn't have any problems wearing it. So I did take this with me on a trip to Mexico for a wedding, and I was able to wear it there. I'm also going to wear it today to a concert that I'm going to later. And I think it is just a really cute little crop top. What else do I have to say about this? Yeah, I think one thing is that before blocking, this bralette crop top looked really funny because of the 3x3 rib. The 3x3 rib was kind of sucking it in so much that it basically looked like this, and it was less than the width of my hand. And in the pattern, Jessie actually says that you need to trust the process because the 3x3 rib will stretch out and it will look very funny before blocking. So I wasn't too worried about it when I saw it, but it was funny to see what it looked like pre-blocking. And now it kind of looks like a very normal, cute little crop top. So this is my Rippe Bralette by Jessie Maed Designs. That is all of my finished objects. So let's move on to works in progress. My first work in progress is the Lanark Sweater by Rebecca Clove. This is a half zip or quarter zip maybe sweatshirt that is in all over half fisherman's rib or half brioche stitch that has a drop shoulder construction. And so far I have knit the full length of the body and also one sleeve. So I just have the other sleeve to go, and then I think we knit a facing for this collar and then sew in the zipper. So this is a pattern that I started knitting back in February is when I casted it on, and I cast on the third size, and the yarn that I'm using is the Fiber Co. Cumbria, and this is a yarn that is a blend of two types of wool, Mashem wool and merino, and also has mohair in it. And I really do like how this yarn is coming out and the fabric that it's creating. I did do a mid-project block for this sweater, so this is the fabric that is the blocked version of the sweater, and I did do that mid-project blocking because of the blocking disaster that I had with my Mia sweater, and I didn't want that to happen with this sweater, so I really wanted to see how much it was going to grow and whether or not the length was going to be correct before I finished knitting the length of the body and the length of the sleeve to just make sure that it wasn't going to be too long. Now I do feel like I have the opposite problem, so I'm kind of worried about whether or not it's actually too short. So maybe I'll try it on and you guys can help me decide about that. I maybe wanted the length to be a little more cropped than a normal sweatshirt, but one thing that I wasn't really thinking about is the fact that this sweater does have a ribbing at the bottom, so it goes from this half brioche stitch to a 1x1 rib, and that kind of cinches it in just a tiny bit. And usually I think what happens is that then if this were full length, you would kind of get part of the sweater hanging over that cuff in like a nice way. But I feel like because mine is just a little bit too short, then it doesn't have as much of this fabric hanging over this cuff as it sits on my hip. So I don't know if that is too short or not. I did already bind off the stitches with an Italian bind off, so I probably won't change it for the time being, and see how much it bothers me when I have finished it and actually am wearing it around. Also, this is the length of the sleeve, and I think I am pretty happy with the length of the sleeve. The 1x1 rib cuff is knit after I blocked it, so I think this cuff will stretch out a little bit, and I think that length will be pretty nice. So this is what my Lanark sweater currently looks like. This is the first time that I'm knitting a brioche stitch, and I do find it very fun to knit. So I am an English style knitter, so I throw my yarn over the needles, and I think with the way that brioche is knit with the yarn overs, which is the way that I'm doing it, it's really kind of flowy. You get into this flow where you're just kind of throwing the yarn for the yarn overs and then doing the purl, and I have really enjoyed knitting this stitch actually. I think it's going to be fun to put in the zipper. That's not something that I've done before, and I don't actually know how that will be done, but I'm sure that I'll be able to look up instructions and the video at that point. And yeah, I think I am close to finishing this sweater, so hopefully by the next time this will be a finished object. Let me just take this off again. Okay. My second whip is the Braidy loop cardigan by Other Loops, and this is the progress that I have so far on it. So this cardigan is a saddle shoulder V-neck cardigan. So this portion of it is going to be that shoulder. And I have already gotten to the point where I've picked up stitches all around it, and then I will be basically knitting from the top down from now on. In this cardigan, it has these two cables that run down the length of the sleeve. So one is kind of across the back, but both of these two cables will then go all the way down the sleeve. And I thought this design was really cool looking, and that's the main reason that I wanted to knit this cardigan. And the yarn that I'm using for this cardigan is Carabella Yarns Aurora 8, and this 8 stands for the number of plies in this yarn. So it's an 8-ply yarn, worsted weight, and one interesting thing that I didn't really know about this yarn was that when you knit with it, see if I can get some good lighting, the stitches don't turn out as little V's and instead you have these like really prominent vertical lines that run up and down. And I didn't really know why that happened before, but I looked it up and it has to do with how the yarn is spun. And because this is an 8-ply yarn that is highly spun, that is just the way that the stitches like to lie when they're flat. And you can also see that in the whip. So it does have this kind of interesting stitch texture. This is one of my first cable projects, and I had tried to follow some instructions to cable without a cable needle, but this cable is 4 stitches that you have to move, and I think because of the number of stitches and because this yarn is so slippery, it was really hard to knit the cables without using a cable needle. And I still don't have a cable needle, but basically I'm just using one of my double pointed needles as a cable needle, and that seems to work fine. And I think I'm making some pretty good progress on it. I mean, really, I just started, so it's just been a few days of knitting on this. But it was cool to kind of see this saddle shoulder appear and learn a new construction technique. So this is my Braidy loop cardigan. Those are my 2 whips that I have going on. So now let's move on to acquisitions and future plans. So this was a yarn that I picked up on the Bay Area Yarn Crawl. This was from Dharma Trading Co. in San Rafael, California, which is in the North Bay, and it's an alpaca bouclé yarn. I think it's Trendsetter Tea Bear is the brand of yarn. And when I did look online for information about this, it does seem like this is a discontinued yarn. But I was just really drawn to this fluffiness, the texture, and the color. So I picked up this 1 ball of yarn, and here is a swatch that I made of it. And the pattern that I'm gonna be knitting with this yarn is the Polar Teddy Jacket by Anne Catrin. And I am so excited to knit this jacket. So I did order more of this yarn, I think from a yarn store that was actually in North Carolina that had it in stock. And I have the box with me right now, so I feel like it could be fun to try to open it on camera and show this yarn off. Okay, so let's see how I'm gonna do this, but maybe I could just put it here. Okay. So, okay, let's take a look at this. This is the yarn that I got. Let me see. So this is Tea Bear from Trendsetter Yarns, and I actually got more of this brown color, and I also got black. So what I'm planning to do is actually to hold one strand of the black with one strand of the brown. This swatch that I knit is with two strands held together, and that is how the pattern is written for the polar teddy jacket. So I already saw that I hit gauge with these 2 strands of this yarn. In the sample pictures for this jacket, it's actually knit with 2 colors as well. So it's a light cream color and a darker cream color. And when you hold those 2 yarns together, it makes this really cool marling effect. And I thought that I could achieve it in this darker colorway. This will probably have a lot lower contrast, but I think I'm gonna knit up a swatch of this with these 2 held together to see what that looks like, and compare it to the swatch that I have that is just the brown, because I do really like how this brown looks. I think this would make like a really cute jacket. So maybe I will knit up these into a swatch so that I can insert some pictures here. And that way you can help me choose. I think if I were to do the brown, then I would have to order more of this brown color. But I did see that it's also in stock in one of the stores that is actually in San Francisco. So I just had noticed that they also stock this yarn. So I think it would be possible to get enough brown to do that. So I'm really excited about this project, really looking forward to knitting it, and I really think this is like the type of jacket that would be so useful and is the kind of thing that I would really love to wear. So really excited and looking forward to that project. Another future project that I have planned is that I was just accepted to be part of a test knit. And I think the tee is called the Blank Canvas Tee. And I will be knitting it up. I think the deadline is in June. So I have all of May to knit it up, and it is a circular yoke tee that has a slip stitch detail down the front center. And this will be my first test knit, so I'm very excited to be a part of that, and I will definitely share more about that process as I start knitting that. The last thing that I want to mention that is really cool is that I am going on a field trip with a yarn store in the Bay Area. This is Fengari Fiber Arts, which is one of the stores that I visited on the Bay Area yarn crawl. So during that time, because I had checked out, I did end up going to all 21 of the stores, and I did buy a lot of stuff during that time. So I have some of this yarn that I already showed you. I also have some other yarn that I bought on this yarn crawl. But because I went to all of these stores, for some of them I did sign up to be on their newsletters to see yarn, because I am kind of obsessed with yarn right now. But I got an email from Fengari Fiber Arts recently, and they are going on a field trip to Valhalla Yarns Company's farm. So this is a local yarn company here in the Bay Area, where they have alpaca and sheep that are on this farm. So they have the entire process from fiber to yarn is happening in this area on the peninsula. I guess it's kind of the coast. And I am very excited to be going on this field trip. There is a yearling alpaca, so a baby alpaca there that I think we'll get to see. And I will also get to learn a lot more about how yarn is made. This is not something that I have a lot of knowledge about, though I have seen some people spin their own yarn on YouTube now. And I guess that is kind of the extent of my knowledge about it. But I think it'll be really cool to see the animals on the farm, and then also tour. And I think they'll probably answer questions about how the fiber is turned into yarn. So I hope that I will be able to get some footage of that while I'm there, and I think it would be really fun to share some clips of that next time. So that will be something to look forward to. So anyways, I think this is the end of the first episode. I hope that you have enjoyed hanging out with me, and that you will continue to hang out with me next time. If you've made it this far, I would love if you would consider subscribing or leaving me a comment. My Instagram is also tangystitches, so if you want to follow me there, that would be great as well. So this was really fun, and I hope to see you all next time.